Ok, ¿me puede decir su nombre?
Silvia Hernández.
Hernández, ok. Y tiene 10 años estar viviendo
Sí,
aquí.
más o menos 10 años.
Sylvia Hernandez has been living with her family on the outskirts of Boardman in eastern Oregon for over 10 years. She's worked at the nearby port of Morrow as an onion powder packer.
Cuando vino aquí, ¿qué le dijeron del agua?
Que estaba bien, que sí servía para tomar, pero yo nunca, no me sentí segura de tomarla. Yo siempre he comprado el agua para tomar.
¿Y alguna razón?
Because of where she lives, she has a private well for water instead of being connected to the public water system. She said when she moved in, she was told her well water was fine to drink straight from the faucet, but she never felt comfortable drinking it that way and bought bottled water to drink instead. And it's a good thing she did. In 2022, the local health department tested her well water for nitrates, a naturally occurring chemical that's also found in fertilizer. Former Morrow County Commissioner Jim Doherty came back to deliver her test results.
It was 47.9 was hers. Of the 6 samples in the park right here, which is higher than all the rest, and the others did have...
Her nitrate levels were nearly 5 times the federal safe drinking water limit. And Hernandez is not the only one who's been caught off guard like this. In a series of local community meetings in Morrow County, other residents spoke up about their experiences, like Mike Pearson.
And Mike, how long have you lived here and how long have you been drinking the water?
30 years.
30 years. And when did you first learn that the water in your well was not safe to drink?
To the degree that it's not safe, about a year ago.
And Paulo Lopez Sr.
Tenemos muchas enfermedades. Hay personas con muchas enfermedades, no las tenemos nosotros.
There's a lot of people who have health concerns, health issues.
Y tenemos personas que nunca se dieron cuenta que tenían ese agua que no se puede tomar.
And there's so many people who had no idea that that water was not safe to drink.
And Gloria Munoz, a 19-year-old who said she'd just heard about the area's nitrate pollution earlier that day.
Yo tengo 19 años y planeo cosas a futuro. Como muchos aquí ya hicieron su futuro, sin saber que estaba contaminado el agua, que su propiedad estaba contaminada.
She said that as a teenager, she plans for her future, that it's unfair to so many others who plan their future here without knowing that their water and their land was contaminated, and that what they invested to be able to flourish here has instead withered away. You may have heard about Flint, but this water pollution crisis has been unfolding right here in Oregon. And it's not new. Nitrate pollution of groundwater has been a known problem in the Lower Umatilla Basin for over 3 decades, and the problem's only getting worse. OPB's Monica Samayoa and Antonio Sierra have been covering this issue for years, and they're here to talk it through with us today. I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. Let's start with the very most basic thing. What is nitrate, and how does it become a problem like it has in the basin?
So nitrate is used as a fertilizer. It's found naturally in soil, and it's beneficial to help plants grow. In Morrow and Umatilla Counties, already rich agricultural places, nitrates are also coming from industrial wastewater. Basically, that's the water food processing plants use to wash their products, or the water that data centers use to keep their systems cool.
Okay.
Once that water completes its job, it turns into wastewater. Then, if you have a permit, you can collect it and use it to irrigate on nearby farms. So for some, like farmers, that's a big win-win. It helps them save money on fertilizer and water. But when too much of this wastewater is over-applied to farmland, it starts to seep into the groundwater and contaminates it. Mm-hmm. The Environmental Protection Agency said that nitrate levels above 10 milligrams per liter can cause health effects that could lead to respiratory infections or even cancer. So the state regulates and monitors the public water systems, but they don't regulate people who get their tap water from private wells. And this is where that problem gets really big. So there's no rules for that. And it's up to the well owner to do their own testing and ensure that their water is drinkable. Many people aren't aware of this issue and they don't know that they're drinking contaminated water. They don't even know what their levels are.
And we heard from a few locals a minute ago about their experience with this. I think one that stood out to me was the 19-year-old Gloria Munoz, who was talking about her experience.
Yeah, you hear her she's pleading with whoever she's speaking to about, hey, you lived your life. You've made your decisions. Don't make my decisions. I still have a whole life to live. And that to me, that part hit me. Hearing these voices and hearing people's stories, it brings me back to when I went out to Boardman and I was meeting with many people who were open to talking with me about, their nitrate levels, whether they knew or they didn't know about it. And it's just kind of, you can hear that urgency in their voice and kind of pleading like, hey, we need help here.
Yeah, just to take us back into that room. This is a very young girl, and then she speaks in front of these lawmakers with this incredible composure, but with such clarity in what she's saying. And she didn't even know this was a problem even a day or two ago, but she's already demanding action and already demanding that she be heard. I mean, that reminds you what the stakes are for this story. That this could be life or death.
Who are all the residents in this area who are most affected by nitrate-contaminated groundwater?
Anyone that owns a private well and gets their water from there. But as we heard, demographically, it's lower income folks and Latinos. So the region is home to many Latinos in which, English is not their first language, just how we heard right now. People are just finding out about this issue. And so there have been many efforts from local organizations that have not only been testing wells, but also educating people on the health impacts and helping them understand that their water is not drinkable. Like Ana Maria Rodriguez, she's a local organizer with the group Oregon Rural Action. And on a recent tour of the area around her home in Boardman, her colleague Nella Parks pointed this out.
The most important thing about where we are right now is on the left-hand side is the county and the right-hand side is the city. So if Ana Maria lived on the right-hand side of the road, she would have safe water, but she lives on the left-hand side of the road, so she has unsafe water.
These two counties are bolstered by a multi-million-dollar agriculture industry. That industry is powered by Latin American immigrants, and it's reflected in the area's demographics. And what critics are saying is that the same people that make the basin's economy function are also the most at risk for nitrate pollution because they live in places that rely on private wells.
Yeah, and I just want to say really quick, too, that Sylvia Hernandez, who we heard from, that was so interesting to me that she works at Port of Morrow. So I think that's really true.
Right. Ana Maria Rodriguez, she is a former farm worker as well. And she's talked about working in the onion fields. So people are really close to this issue. They know how both sides of the coin work, being affected by it and also working for the industry.
And I have met people that have not wanted to talk to me when I go out and visit because they either work for the Port of Morrow or for Lamb Weston or for any other food processor there in fear of losing their job.
And this is not a new problem. It has been a known issue in this area for over 30 years. What happened back then when people first realized this was happening?
All right, well, stay with me here.
Okay.
So the state did some testing in the late 80s and found that the nitrate levels were beyond the safe drinking water limit. That led to the creation of a voluntary committee called the Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Area. And I'm just going to refer to them as a groundwater committee. They represent a lot of different groups from city officials, state agencies, water districts, industry like the Port of Morrow, and farmers. At first, they were tasked with finding out where the excess nitrate is coming from and create voluntary guidelines to help lower those levels. So, they started to monitor hundreds of wells in the region and were able to identify 5 main sources of pollution. And I should say that they got the help from DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, to kind of test those wells and get that data. So they found that irrigated agriculture, food processing wastewater, animal operations like dairies and feedlots, sewage from septic tanks, and the U.S. Army Umatilla Chemical Depot bomb washout lagoons were the 5 main sources. So the committee did what they were tasked, but they have no regulatory power, meaning that they can find the sources where this is coming from. They can come up with solutions, but they're only seen as guidelines and voluntary measures. And, this is why this issue, high nitrates, it continues to be dragged on to today. I spoke with Jim Doherty, who we already heard from. He's a former Morrow County commissioner. And, he also did a stint with a committee, and this is how he felt being on it.
I was on it for a half a dozen years, and we didn't do anything other than try and float it past DEQ and try and talk nice to them and keep them from coming out here so we continue doing what we're doing.
I want to say, hearing that from Jim Doherty, I was a bit shocked. I didn't think he would tell me something like that or be that honest to me of, hey, this is what we did back in the day.
And, we're years later at this point, many years later. What do we actually know now about where this excess nitrate is coming from?
First off, I want to say, what do we know now? Nitrate levels have continued to increase. Steadily increase. What I've really learned is that it depends who you ask about where the excess nitrate is coming from. So DEQ has that chart, right? The 5 sources, but I've talked to other state agencies that question that data. And this is where it gets really confusing to get straight answers as to who the biggest contributor is. So according to DEQ, it's irrigated agriculture.
Okay.
You've seen those huge sprinkler systems when you're driving south or north Interstate 5 or when you're heading east to Boardman. That's irrigated ag. DEQ estimates that section of the pie accounts for almost all of the excess nitrates seeping into the groundwater in the region, about 70%. But DEQ doesn't regulate irrigated agriculture. That's the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And it's very tricky to understand how they even regulate it. So they have this plan that acts like a guide for local farmers on how to prevent pollution. And they're very specific to say that they do not tell anyone how to farm, but provide recommendations about their plan. And it's all voluntary.
So these are like suggestions.
Right.
Yeah.
When I spoke with the Oregon Department of Agriculture, they insisted that voluntary measures are the best way at the moment. Morgan Allen manages their agricultural water quality program.
A voluntary element is the primary way that we seek to advance the program. But there's also a regulatory backstop to that. So really it's about a voluntary effort first, and where that is either not achieving what we want, or if there's individuals that we are able to identify with compliance issues, then we would look to a compliance approach after that.
They do say that if they receive a formal written complaint of agricultural pollution, they investigate, but the agency recently told me that they have not received any complaints related to irrigated agriculture in the region ever.
Ever. 30 years.
Yeah. And it's interesting because here you have one agency that's just kind of like, well, it's all voluntary, right? And then we see the Department of Environmental Quality issuing enforcements and violations toward the Port of Morrow. And it's because of DEQ's fine to the Port of Morrow back in early 2022 is that I became aware of this massive issue, and a lot of fingers have been pointed at them for the reason of the excess nitrates. People are like, oh, well, it must be them. But if we look at DEQ's data and that chart, the port falls under food processing and land application, and that slice of the pie only accounts for nearly 5% of the problem. I do know that there are efforts to get a clear picture of where the excess nitrates are coming from, but even beginning something like that is going to be extremely difficult. So there's a lot that we don't know about how nitrates occur in the region naturally, and that makes it that much more difficult to get answers and the correct data. And as a reporter covering it, it's just very frustrating that it's hard to find those answers.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
And just to think about this, to put it into context, me and Monica have spent hours going to meetings, looking up rules, talking to people inside and outside the basin. We now have an alphabet soup of state agencies we've talked to and all sorts of technical knowledge that neither of us thought we'd ever have. But if you are just a person living in the basin who is having their well tested, it's so much more frustrating to get answers and to get clarity on what's going on.
Are people or companies that are contributors actually making efforts to reduce nitrate themselves?
So the first time I went to Boardman, I met with a farmer, Jake Madison, who spent nearly all of his time explaining his very scientific process on how he consistently collects soil samples. He wants to make sure that he's using every bit of water and fertilizer already in the soil.
Those are two precious resources, natural resources that are extremely valuable, and we can't afford to waste from a sustainability standpoint or from a financial standpoint or from a community health standpoint.
But he told me not every farmer is consistently testing their soil to check for nitrate levels. He also shared with me other thoughts on why the state hasn't been able to find a solution.
Nobody's come together and said, all right, we're done pointing fingers. Let's start talking about real solutions. And that's what it's going to take. That's why it's been 30 to 50 years of nothing happening.
Madison is just one farmer, but other big players in the local agriculture industry are represented by a group called Water for Eastern Oregon. Group members told me they can be a part of finding a long-term solution to nitrate pollution. Board member Debbie Rady is the chief operating officer of Boardman Foods, and she told me why she was motivated to help.
These are communities that our employees work at. These are communities that we live at. I have a well. Many of my friends and family have wells.
The problem is environmental groups don't buy it. They say that these farms and food processors are most responsible for the pollution, and they're just trying to improve their public image.
Coming up after a short break, we'll hear what elected officials have been doing about this problem and whether it's made a difference for residents with contaminated water in Eastern Oregon. Stay with us. So there has been increasing attention on this issue by people in power in Oregon in the past couple of years. In 2023, visitors to the region included U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley.
Thank you for putting up the signs with the levels at your homes.
Oregon Governor Tina Kotek.
I want you to know that I want you to be able to drink your water.
And members of the Oregon Legislature's BIPOC caucus visited as well, like Representative Ricky Ruiz, whose district is in Gresham and Southeast Portland.
What's happening in your communities, what's happening in your home is simply not okay.
So there has been a lot of activity. And Antonio, I know that you've been there in Eastern Oregon attending lots of these visits. I'm wondering, has this increased attention from political leaders and lawmakers actually moved the needle? How have people in elected office been addressing this that you've seen?
Right. It really started with local government leaders. The Morrow County Board of Commissioners declared an emergency in June 2022. It expired by the end of the year. However, the state got involved after that. The Oregon Health Authority put together a campaign to get wells tested. OHA also identified about 3,200 homes who draw their water from private wells. As of January, only 1,600 wells have had their tests completed.
Okay, wait, so that's like half, right?
Yes, of the total wells that they've identified. That might not even be a full picture of how many wells there are. There's no central database. They said that they could only test so many homes because there were no trespassing signs, or people just flat out refused to get their wells tested. The other factor in this is that local government and state government aren't the only ones keeping track of this. The Environmental Protection Agency has the authority to get involved if they want to, and to set regulations and to enforce rules. However, what we've heard from officials is that at this point, they just want to sit and observe and wait to see what the state does. And they're giving them a pretty long leash to do that. But I don't want to act like no one is doing anything to solve this. When local leaders complained that there were no Spanish speakers on the groundwater committee, the governor's office stepped in and made sure that a Latino was seated on the committee to fill a vacancy. I also want to say that there are some parts of the federal government that are taking action on this. Local government officials say that Merkley's office played a really important role in securing a grant to start plans to connect well owners to public drinking water systems. But I think people are still really frustrated even after all of the actions that have been taken. And they still feel like the government hasn't done enough to help them clean the nitrates from the groundwater. There was one young resident, Paulo Lopez Jr., who came to speak at one of the community meetings that was held by Governor Kotek. He told the governor through tears how worried he was for their family's health after realizing that the water wasn't safe to drink. A few months later, when the state lawmakers came to town, he had this to say to them.
The governor did not just promise me. She promised all of us. She has barely done anything. And I would like to help by speaking for those who can't or who don't want to speak. And I would just like you to remind the governor about her promise.
Wow. I've never heard that. And it goes to show that everyone there is listening very closely to what, federal, state, and city officials are saying and are promising. And so when that doesn't get delivered, they're right there and they're going to call you out on it. And that's exactly what we've been seeing.
Right. And he's not speaking metaphorically. When people say that they feel that the state hasn't held up its part of the bargain, they are referencing things like the fact that Kotek talked about hiring a state epidemiologist to study the connection between nitrates and some of the health outcomes that people are seeing on the ground. And that hasn't materialized yet. And when we've asked about it, the state has told us that actually they don't intend to hire one right now, that that's really not what they're prioritizing.
So all three of us are Latinos, and I'm wondering for the two of you, did that affect your approach to reporting on this or your experience in general covering this story?
I grew up in a suburb in Los Angeles. It's also a majority Latino place, but it's so much different than Boardman. By the time I was growing up in the community that I grew up in, Latinos were already well established and generations deep. When I look at Eastern Oregon, I get the sense that the Latino roots are a lot shallower, but they are growing. I wonder, is this going to be a galvanizing issue? Is this going to be an issue that inspires change from that younger generation? Is this going to be a thing that defines the community going forward?
For myself, being Latina and being fluent in Spanish helped me connect with a lot more people, and it helped me understand the issue more deeply. I think because there's such a language barrier that, many people feel like they aren't being heard or they're not understanding what's happening. And there's this desperate need of trying to get that information to know what is happening. And so when I have spoken with people and approached them and speak in their language, I see the relief in their faces and their eyes that they're like, oh my gosh, I'm talking to someone that can finally understand me. And they kind of let all of their feelings out. They let me know about the issues that they're seeing and can express themselves way better. And so I feel like that sense of urgency that I get from talking to so many people and hearing their personal stories, them inviting me into their homes to kind of be like, well, this is what my water filter looks like, or these are the amounts of water bottles that I have to buy, or here's my back house where my filter is. What do you mean there's a water problem? Or, I hear stories of people like, oh, I don't cook with this water, but I shower with it. Is that going to impact me? So it's just like hearing those concerns and those questions motivates me to continue to cover this.
So what do residents whose drinking water is contaminated still need today?
In the short term, people still need tests, filters, and clean water. We're still hearing about people that are just finding out that their tap water is unsafe to drink, which is, again, kind of a mind-boggling thing given how long we've been covering this issue. I've heard complaints that the state's drinking water deliveries aren't always on time, or that they're not providing enough water for what the household needs. The medium-term solutions involve connecting people to public water systems or digging deeper wells if they live too far out to be connected. But the plans that are in the works aren't expected to be delivered for another couple of years. The long-term issue is simple in its explanation, and that's just reducing the nitrate levels in the groundwater. Even if nitrate pollution stops tomorrow, it would still take many years for those levels to go down.
So even if every single thing changed right now, this would still be a problem for years.
Right. Even if every farm went offline and every food processor closed its doors, it's going to take some time for the nitrates to filter out of the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also that people want more information about nitrates and how it impacts their health that's easily digestible. And just as Antonio said, people need to understand that this is not an issue that can be solved tomorrow. Ultimately, people need to see the state agencies come together, create and enforce more regulations for known polluters, and solve the issues together.
Monica and Antonio, thank you both so much for keeping us and the public informed on this issue.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Monica Samayoa is OPB's climate and environment reporter, and Antonio Sierra is OPB's rural communities reporter. You can read much more of their ongoing coverage of nitrate pollution in Eastern Oregon at opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. If you're here listening right now, you are a part of our brand new podcast family. Help us grow by leaving a review on your favorite podcast app. Follow us there, and hey, tell your friends. This episode was produced by yours truly. Our technical director is Stephen Cray. He also engineered this episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Julie Sabatier, Mia Estrada, and Sage Van Wing. And Monica Samayoa and Antonio Sierra did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. If you have questions for us, please hit us up. You can send us an email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.